Hello everyone, thanks for joining us for tonight's MHTV. Really exciting episode tonight, because tonight we're talking about mindfulness, something that I'm really interested in, that I practice. And I guess we're talking about it not as a panacea for everything in mental health, but you know, a little bit of a discussion about the pros and the cons, you know, where it works, what might the limitations be. So we're joined by Dr. Joey Webber, who is a mindfulness consultant and has recently published a book about mindfulness, and is also a PhD as well. So I'll hand you over to Joey in a minute. First of all, we'll go to Nicky though to tell you how you can join in tonight.
Hello everyone, lovely to have you with us. Obviously you can join in as usual. We're really pleased to have any questions from you. I've tweeted out the links on Facebook, so join in on the Facebook Live, or you can join us on the hashtag MHTV, and that's on Twitter. So any questions you've got, by all means, please ask them and join in. Thank you.
Thank you. So Joey, it'd be really great if we could just start really with a little bit of an intro from you about your own mindfulness journey and why you became interested in mindfulness. Where did it all start?
Okay, so my name's Joey Webber, and nice to meet you all. My own mindfulness journey was kind of it's been an interesting one. I was very fortunate, I think, to have kind of alternative parents, if you like. They both didn't follow kind of a normal trajectory that a Western person might. They both, I guess, they fell in love with Buddhism in the 70s, and in different ways. You know, my dad's kind of a Tibetan Buddhist iconographer, like one of his images is behind me, and then my mum has taken a more teaching consultant route, and she's developed her own mindfulness practice, which I trained under as well. So as a child, growing up with parents, you know, who I guess practice it themselves, and certainly the environment around me was very much part and parcel of life. And that's not to say that I've been practicing all my life, because, you know, it's almost impossible, I would say. But there have been moments, there has been very many moments and different stages of my life that I've kind of gravitated towards it. Probably, you know, as a kid, I mean, they actually say that, don't they? You know, children and animals are actually the most mindful because they're very much present. So as a child, you kind of maybe naturally a bit mindful. But then as you grow up, you kind of become a lot more distracted. You've got a lot more story to tell. There's a whole big history and past there that you're kind of constantly looking around. And also you've got this whole future element, you know, who am I? What am I going to do when I grow up? All this kind of stuff. And you kind of constantly projecting into the future, and we lose our mindful selves. We become very kind of distracted, and you know, everything around us also feeds into that kind of distraction economy, mobile phones, laptops, all of that type of thing. So I probably kind of didn't do so much in teens, and then early 20s kind of moved back to it. Certainly when it exploded in the kind of 70s, mindfulness-based stress reduction, John Kabat-Zinn, and this whole kind of movement came over into the West. I definitely thought, wow, okay, I can use this in a professional capacity too. And not only does this help me, because, you know, I'm a lot nicer person when I'm mindful than when I'm not, but it also can help other people. And by doing that, you're helping yourself. It's kind of an interrelational quality about it. So you go up and down with it in different contexts, different situations, you know. You can be very mindful one week, and then, you know, I'd go to see my family and completely, whatever it is, you know, it shouldn't be so strict. We shouldn't be so strict with it. So up and down progression with it,
Yeah, I think that's really realistic. And for people who are listening tonight, because obviously you hear mindfulness being bandied around all the time, particularly if you go onto Instagram. So for people who don't know much about mindfulness, how would you describe it? What is it?
So mindfulness is kind of a basic definition. It always kind of involves this kind of present moment orientation with awareness and kind of an open curiosity and acceptance. No matter what's happening at this moment, we are very much fully here. So we're fully present now in this conversation, and we're nowhere else. You kind of, on a moment-to-moment basis, you're kind of aware of this moment as it unravels. And so that's also being bodily aware of all our sensations in us that are constantly changing on a moment-to-moment basis. So it's complete present moment orientation with awareness and kind of non-judgmental attitude as well towards whatever arises. We kind of just be with. It's very much a being and not a doing thing, which is kind of very much contrary to how we normally live, perhaps. Constantly doing things, sending an email while we're shoving a sandwich in our mouth, planning the meeting or planning who's going to get the kids, what's for tea, all that type of stuff. It's kind of constantly in kind of analytical thought state, the dreamlike nature of thought, was actually mindfulness says, hang on a minute. Let's be in the now, present moment.
Yeah, it's really so about slowing yourself down as well.
Yeah, I guess you could say it's in one way it's slowing down, but it's not to say that you function slowly. You can still very much be part of life and try and be as mindful as you can be, but it's not to say that it inhibits or restricts kind of other things you can do, because there's a time for planning, there's a time for analysis, there's a time for reflection, but there's also a time for kind of regaining that kind of inner balance and that kind of mental stability that then actually, and paradoxically, it creates this opportunity for us to do more things because we're kind of mentally rested. So in one way it's slowing, in another way it's just kind of becoming more in tune with what is the reality of time and how quickly it goes.
Yeah. And there's two types of mindfulness, isn't there? There's obviously the informal part, which is about, taking a walk, for example, and really focusing on what you can see and hear and smell around you, or painting or even baking can be mindful, can't it, if you focus on what you're doing. There's also the meditative element of mindfulness, isn't it? For people who are listening, can you tell us a little bit about the different types of mindfulness for people who might be interested in trying it out for the first time?
Okay, yeah. So I'd say rather than maybe different types, there's one kind of type, but it's like like a coin. It's got two sides. You need both to function as a coin. So it's like there is the kind of understanding, the intellectual stuff, the kind of concepts of mindfulness, but at the same time is the application, the method, turning towards actual meditation. And so while we can, on one hand be reading, discussing, analyzing and understanding it intellectually, we also need to apply that. So it's like that. Only then can you probably say, trying mindfulness now. Otherwise, if you just read a book about it or you read an article, after 10 minutes, you've made your mind up already. You've projected onto the article where it's coming from, what political message it carries, and then you kind of accept or reject based on, your kind of who you think you are. Whereas, that's why you constantly revisit the meditation and put it into practice. That's not to say that meditation has to be sat down, eyes closed. You can do walking meditation. I think some of the things you're referring to can kind of, seep into that kind of sensory experience. You can do lying down, walking. You can have a mindful shower. When I started the training with my mum, there was a lot of the time about mindful eating. You can eat a chocolate mindfully and all of this type of stuff. And of course you can, because you're using the same principle, the same psychological principle, but applying it to day-to-day activity. So, normally when we have a chocolate, we've already got a hand in the box for the other. But with it, when you're mindfully eating a chocolate, you're just eating the chocolate. And that's being aware of all the sensory experience that's happening, all the different flavorful tones that arise, and your reaction, the saliva in your mouth, all of that type of stuff. So you can apply it, but really when we say there's one mindfulness, it's just you need kind of both to appreciate it. And I think only when you've really tasted it can you then say, okay, I've tried mindfulness now. I think there's one of the issues with them. And I've written about it in my book, actually, the popularity paradox is because it's so mainstream, or been made almost perhaps too accessible, that now we've got a lot of people going, oh, I know about that, and but actually no, I like to do this, or and they have got this pre kind of assumption about what it is without actually maybe trying it properly, or having a guided instructor to sit with you and do a mindfulness of breathing exercise. It's a whole different thing when you actually experience it from reading a book.
Yeah, definitely. So tell us about your book anyway as well.
Okay, so I've just been lucky enough to finish my PhD last year, and it's always been a bit of a vision or kind of obsession, perhaps, that I wanted to turn it into a book, because I believe that I've looked at a construct that adds a bit of kind of therapeutic quality to mindfulness, to contemporary mindfulness. So I've been kind of, just always wanting to make it as accessible as possible. And I think maybe, my background and upbringing, etc., it's kind of probably played around the kind of spiritual, religious type arenas, but also the kind of down to earth, this is actually me, and, on a weekend I like to do this, and have these mates, and I enjoy football, and blah, blah, blah. So it's this kind of, these two worlds, do they have to be separate?
Yeah.
And that's the big question. And so really the book is about making equanimity, which is, I think, was what I've tried to make it is as secular as possible, but it was kind of this mystic kind of unknown kind of quality or construct that is in most major religions, but not really understood. It's kind of like, whoa, I'm not like that, it's too far out for me, or I don't really understand what that is. I like the idea, but how do I actually do it? So what I've tried to do is kind of mold, craft, and kind of sculpt a very secular version that can be applied in clinical practice and used in day-to-day life. And hopefully we can have a more equanimous mindset, which may help with division and our judgmental mind, because the whole idea really comes from the fact that I had a problem with the term non-judgment that was used very much in mindfulness, because I kind of feel like it's an oxymoron. It's almost impossible for a human to be non-judgmental. We naturally are. And so for me, equanimity is a much more suitable construct than the non-judgment, in terms of going that little bit deeper, which involves a bit of self-analysis. It involves a little bit of compassion for others and self-compassion too,
Yeah, compassion's a big part of mindfulness, isn't it?
It is. It really is. And I think it's also an element that is in some instances overlooked. And that's, there's been quite a lot of commentary about unethical practice, or, if you can train a sniper to be mindful, are they really mindful? The question of ethics comes into it. And then it's like, okay, that's a different area here. So, we need constructs to equally link to some kind of value or virtue. So for me, equanimity binds mindfulness with compassion. So it's inextricably linked. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Nicky, any thoughts from you at this one?
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions, if that's all right. It's a bit early, but why not? Why not bust them out if they're there? I've got a question from a year one student. What's the difference between mindfulness and meditation? So I think there's still a little bit, maybe it's a little bit fuzzy as an idea. Another one, how do you use this to support well-being or mental health? And again, I think that takes us back to the good stuff about mindfulness, but also some of the ways maybe that it's been inappropriately used as well. So maybe we can touch on that. And we've got a comment from Adrian. First of all, belated happy birthday, Vanessa, which is always nice to hear. And then Adrian saying, strong believer in mindfulness and action. So living in the moment. So maybe we can think a little bit about that. Allowing the time to feel and sense what's around. How can mindfulness be brought into the workplace or study? So that's loads of questions.
Oh, yeah.
There has to be so many. So if you just ignore the birthday bit, do the other bits.
Ignore the birthday.
How about we ignore the questions, just sing happy birthday.
So the first one was about what's the difference between mindfulness and meditation?
So mindfulness is, to be mindful is to be in a meditative state, really. So mindfulness is meditation. But at the same time, you can probably approach mindfulness without meditation. You can just read about it. You can just understand it as a concept, what it is, what it's trying to say, what it is and what it's not. So you can have a theoretical understanding of mindfulness. But then when you turn that into the actual method, then it's meditation.
Right.
So it's like, it's like a list of ingredients on a cake, isn't it? It's not a cake until you've made it into a cake. So it's like mindfulness is a whole host of instruction. But until you put it in the oven, you meditate, then you understand it. So it's like, it's separate and it's not separate. It's kind of, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's theory practice, really, isn't it?
Which kind of really takes us on to the next question. Very smoothly done, Jerry. The thing about basically how might this be important for mental health practice or well-being?
I think hugely important, because you're really working with your own state of mind, and you're working with that in a preventative capacity as well. So I think some of the mis-selling and the mis-kind of paradox is, when I'm stressed, I'll do 10 minutes of meditation and then it'll all be gone, and then, oh God, thank God for a bit of mindfulness now. I've had a really bad week, I'll just do it and everything will be solved. And it's a total misunderstanding of actually that what you do with mindfulness is you're kind of preparing the mind. So in preparing and kind of settling the mind, then you're more aware of thoughts in relation to who you are and experiences. So you're more readily able to deal with those as it unfolds rather than be overwhelmed and consumed by them. So very much works well in the arenas of anxiety and depression and things like that. But as a preventative thing as well, it's just what I really want to do more of is kind of, there's a lot of misconception that 10 minutes can save your life, or just do that and we'll be happiest people alive, all of this type of stuff. And it's completely wrong. Really, we need to be practicing day to day and building that strength. It's the muscle analogy, isn't it? It's like you go to the gym, you don't start off with 100 kilograms. 100 kilograms, is that even heavy? It shows how long I've got
heavy. I think we get where you're going with it though. You don't pick up the heaviest weight, you start and work up to it.
You start very slowly and you build up. And then it's like, wow, the mind's quite strong here. It's quite resilient. It's quite buoyant to change, So when things happen, you're less, easily swept away in crazy emotions or negative mind states.
I think you're right. I think the more you practice as well, the easier it is to find your balance. So I was saying to you guys before we started, I'd fallen out of doing it, just fallen out of practice of meditating and having sort of mindful time. And as lockdown happened and I suddenly had a lot more time on the hands, I went back to it. And it was a struggle to get back into it. And but now I find myself much easier to stabilize than I used to be. What I do find though, and I think maybe I'd love to talk about this from my perspective, if that's right, is what you do on the days when it's tough, because not every day I find I don't have the same amount of balance every day. Some days I find it really hard to concentrate and I can maybe only do 5 minutes, and it takes me a real struggle just to stay still. And then other days, an hour is no problem. So I think maybe pushing my way into other people's questions there. We can come back to that in a bit. But I guess we should do Adrian's first because he did ask first, which is this idea about how can mindfulness be brought into the workplace? So I guess that maybe that's as a mental health nurse or study for our students that are watching.
Mm-hmm. So there's plenty of research out there to support mindfulness in the workplace. Different studies have actually been done on it and leadership and all this type of stuff. So, but how do you really bring it into the workplace? You can kind of embody the qualities of mindfulness and it'll ripple out. Because really, when we say workplace, I mean, a workplace is just, it's a building with a lot of people in it doing certain tasks. So, we can't go, oh, everyone's got to be mindful now. But what we can do is we can be mindful, and then perhaps that'll ripple out. And then you've got a culture change and a culture shift. And that's the thing that also is something that, when we talk about mindfulness and social change and things like that, that's something that, we could strengthen with. So it becomes less as a selfish practice, but more of a kind of, it ripples out. And, just by leading by example and a role model, you can bring it into the workplace. But obviously it helps if you've got managers and things that support it. Have team meetings, start off with 10 minutes of meditation, have the meeting, and then you could end with 10 minutes. There's plenty of opportunities to it. At lunchtime, you could be like, you know what, I'm not going to eat at the desk hunched over and, just trying to show off how much work I'm doing, but I'm just going to take myself away, give myself 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, 1 hour, and do it that way. Yeah, and if there's training, if you're lucky enough to have in an organization that has training, then you could be part of a much bigger kind of change, in that you could have an instructor or someone come in once a week, twice a week, to kind of remind the culture, steer the culture a little bit, and then hopefully everyone kind of adopts it at the same time. But what we can do to start off really quickly and easily is just be more aware of our mind, where it's going,
isn't it? Because on one hand, I feel quite positive at the thought of it being incorporated into schools, into the starts and ends of lessons or meetings, and then with this idea about it being part of workplace culture and part of just everyday life is really, really positive. But at the same time, I know that I have anxiety as well about the idea that maybe people use it instead of giving decent paying conditions or a good standard of life, and that stuff I think is troubling to me. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think it's a real contemporary issue at the moment, because, and I write about this in the book actually, about that. There's a worry. It depends on the motivation behind why mindfulness is introduced, but there's a worry that it can just be used as a kind of a quick tick box thing. Well, right, we've done our well-being lot, and also it can be used as a kind of, right, well, this person's not mindful enough, and that's why they're stressed. It's nothing to do with the fact that we're pouring 80 to 100 hours on this person a week. It's actually they're not mindful enough. So there's a little bit of a kind of, an organization has to take responsibility for mental health in the workplace. And so that's a really critical point, is that what motivation is mindfulness being used? Is it ethical? Is it non-ethical? Is it altruistic? Is it not? Because there is, we live in a neoliberal capitalist society. It could be used as a kind of a cheap fix, just follow your breath. No money's needed there. Get on with your meditation. Why aren't you working as hard? But obviously that's a real heavy negative attitude. It could be used in a complete positive way, but it depends behind the motivation of the employer. I think we would find that if organizations did have that latter approach, the kind of this positive outlook, that they would have staff that are happy with themselves and their work, and working a little bit more, perhaps. Not to say that it should happen, because we should all have a strict kind of contract and what's healthy, but you might find, especially in the healthcare profession, I know the problem of compassion fatigue and things like that is because things just keep getting put on healthcare staff, and there's always this problem of underfunding, budget cuts, blah blah blah. And so it's like, in that way you can see, mindfulness is just a very easy thing to put in there and to kind of build people up. But that's actually the wrong way of going about it. It's just putting extra load onto people that might not have done much mindfulness, and 10 minutes a month, or they've done on a weekend course, and you suddenly
I think you're right.
to deal with loads.
We've got free mindfulness at work, and I have to say it's one of the nice things about. So one of the few Zoom meetings I actually look forward to. We do it on a Monday, and what's really interesting about it is there's thousands of people who work where I work. There's 7 of us who do mindfulness together, but it really is supportive. It's a really lovely thing. I have one question that's just come in. Vanessa, do you want us to go back to you, or do you want us to ask this question?
Ask the question and then I'll continue.
Yeah, and it's from Gwen, who's saying that Joey's kind of answering that, but is it speaking? That's how good we are, Gwen. She's just saying, will you go into the neurobiology at all? Talking about being around the kind of mindfulness scene maybe about 10 years ago, and then this idea about, I don't know what this means, but somatic experiencing. So this idea about why mindfulness isn't enough as well. So I guess we did answer that a little bit, but I think maybe asking a little bit about neurobiology would be helpful.
Well, we need a neurobiologist here.
There's a really good book. There's a really good book. While I was looking down, I was trying to find it on my Audible list, and I'll tweet it later.
Oh, good.
And it's about the science of mindfulness versus sort of the Buddhist aspect, and I'll share that as well, because I think that's we hear a lot in mental health. People who particularly come from a sort of more biological model, people do ask about the science of mindfulness all the time. I mean, for me, I think mindfulness is a holistic experience, and I think there's a biological aspect, but all the other parts. But I think we might be able to sell mindfulness and encourage people more if people knew more about the science, because there is quite a lot of science, isn't there, about the sort of changes that can happen from practicing mindfulness regularly. There is evidence base about it, because a lot of people I hear on Twitter all the time, there's no evidence base for mindfulness, but there is a really strong evidence base for mindfulness.
There's a massive evidence base for mindfulness. It's in the NICE guidelines for the NHS and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And you're looking at the research, because when you do a PhD, that was one of the first things you have to do is just read about all the research. And it's in so many different areas. So, there is biological stuff there to do with, physiological changes in the body. There's psychological studies, there's neuroscience, there's brain change, there's structural kind of brain change in different parts of the brain, from the amygdala to the insula, all of this type of stuff. So there's fascinating amounts of research out there now. But what happens is, and this is the kind of the popularity paradox, is that what happens is you'll have a commentator, probably from a big news outlet, and they'll write an article probably dissing it, or because they don't like it, or they've not tried it. And I've never really seen anyone put up a real strong case for the evidence base not being there. It's just kind of a comment, because really there's loads. I mean, if you go on the databases and go in the different search terms, it's just mindfulness and everything. It's, there's millions of studies out there. Now, maybe I shouldn't say millions. Maybe I should say hundreds of thousands. Probably more realistic.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think for me, what you were talking about with leadership development, I think it's about, it's a commonly bandied around term about systems approaches, but there is something, isn't there, about, looking after individuals within the system, but also looking at the system as well. So when I used to run something that I did through the leadership development work I did, and we had, day workshops, we did used to do mindfulness at the beginning of those day sessions. And even though I've done mindfulness courses and I practice it, I did feel silly at first, getting everyone to kind of slow down and do some mindfulness for 10 minutes. And because it's so removed from the culture, isn't it? And for me, it was like, I practice mindfulness at home, but if you start practicing it at work, it seems all hippie-like and really removed from the sort of culture. But actually, in the evaluation of that, everybody talked about the mindfulness aspect, which was just a very small part of the day. So people do like it, and I think there is something about changing the culture and also acknowledging that it's not the panacea, not in terms of workforce stress, but also in terms of mental health. And one of the things that I found, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, I did the 8-week MBSR course, but I was the only clinician on the course. And the person who delivered it was certainly an expert in mindfulness from a sort of PhD point of view, because she had a PhD in it. However, my concerns were that there was no mental health practitioner in the room, and there were a few occasions where people were really triggered, and nobody in the room except me knew how to respond to that, and it was quite basic mental health first aid stuff. So I have, as much as I love mindfulness, I have this like reservation about, who is their mindfulness instructor, what's their background. I'm not saying everyone who practices mindfulness or instructs in mindfulness needs to have a clinical background, but I do think there needs to be something about understanding mental health and understanding the sort of potential dangers of mindfulness around triggering people, and around maybe not understanding people's mental health histories, but about understanding that, you might have a room full of people and everyone's going to have a very different history. And
it's not even mental health, is it, when you think about it? There's a reason that people keep busy. There's a reason that people have the TV on all the time, that people have music on all the time, that people block things out. It's a coping strategy, isn't it? In a world where everything is very scary, particularly at the moment. And to have that vibration, that noise is a comfort for some people. And then to take it away without putting anything else in its place is naturally anxiety provoking, isn't it? It's a strategy, isn't it, to manage your life, having busy thoughts. And when they go away and you're left with what else is there, even if you don't have a mental distress, it can be quite an unsettling experience. I think a lot of people are not used to silence, particularly internal silence. Scary.
Yeah, really, really good points. And there's an interesting thing about the whole mindfulness training, and that kind of, who can be a mindfulness trainer. And sometimes it seems, like 8 weeks or a weekend course is enough, because in one it's oversimplified. But I don't know. It's to become a cognitive behavioral therapist, you need 5 years of training and a degree and all this lot. But to be a mindfulness instructor, 2 days seems to be enough. And that there is a kind of bit of a thing there. It's not to say that people who would do the 2 days can't actually really experience some kind of profundity of its practice and really kind of go, wow. But in terms of then teaching others, there needs to be safeguards in place, and different backgrounds. People come with a whole host of misconceptions, stereotypes, prejudgments, all of this stuff, but also, like you say, their own coping strategies. And if you've just been running on autopilot your whole life, you got someone there saying, right, don't do that, and then they don't, and they're like, oh my God, and that is naturally scary for people. But I think if the instructor was sensitive, they'd be like kind of that's okay too, like in the ebb and flow of changing the kind of experience towards things. Then there may be this kind of looking at your anxiety or looking at yourself in a different way. That is naturally scary, because you then go, if I've been on autopilot the whole time and I stop and I go, well, who am I? What is this? We are not our thoughts. Oh my God, well, who are we? That's enough to freak anyone out. And then that's what maybe I think you fall back on. The kind of spiritual religious people go, oh, well, part of God's plan, or I'm reincarnated, I'm going to go here. And that's the kind of, perhaps the people that kind of are okay, because there's some kind of longer purpose or vision. But with the people that don't have that, or they're just non-religious or atheist, and it's like, well, what would be the point? There's no point not doing that. I'm going to be, I like that. I function like that. So in that way, I think that's one of the issues that comes up that is often not talked about too, because it's kind of the deep, profound philosophical questions that kind of are never looked at. So I think there needs to be a model of self-construct, and there needs to also be some virtues and characteristics involved with that, like compassion, to kind of, when you replace your kind of thinking mind with awareness, where does that then lead to, and what are the effects that will happen? So there's this kind of gentle kind of buffer, a soft kind of bouncy castle. You're not just jumping off into the moat, but you're actually just bouncing on the soft, different terrain, and it will be different. We always like when you try anything different, though, of course, is a kind of, oh my God, But at that point, it shouldn't be used as kind of, oh my God, it's it's terrible. It's, you have all these detrimental effects. If mental health's an issue, there should be kind of disclaimers or things at the beginning, because obviously that enters a different kind of platform, more therapeutic, and that's when trained specialists should also be, part of that kind of package. But it's not to say that a trained mindfulness consultant with the relevant background couldn't do that themselves, because it's all about language, isn't it, and meaning and kind of context and this kind of approach. So, but yeah, for some, trying to be mindful in real times of distress is kind of the opposite thing they need too. If you've got someone who's just had a bereavement and they're sat in front of you and you're trying to write, just clear the mind, all this type of stuff. You're not your thoughts, this person just wants to like kind of scream in your face and, say, what the hell are you doing? I'm like, there's all this grief here. When you look in, it's scary. You might not like what you find. So there also should be a little bit of sensitivity about how we approach it and our best state in terms of what's going on for us right now. Because certainly for me, there's sometimes, in extreme emotional, volatile situations, it's like, I'm not mindful. Maybe I'm mindful of how angry I am. But, there's the kind of, you lose kind of sense of practice, but there is this kind of natural returning to this kind of safe place, if you like, in your mind that's kind of a bit more secure afterwards. So it depends what's going on for people. And if there's also this whole huge thing going on with medication, and people on medication and what that does to your brain in terms of giving supplementary chemicals and things like that, and how it changes things. And then also when you're doing mindfulness, it's kind of a natural approach to the mind. There may be some future studies in there that could look at how that actually is viewed and what changes occur in the brain. So there's very complicated, really, when you go into it, because actually there's so many different variables that no one can control for. We're only human beings. So many different variables that we might not be aware of that we're bringing to the table too. Yeah. Some kind of, when I was bullied as a kid or something and it comes back suddenly when you started the mindfulness practice, or you're kind of opening potential for different things to arise. And certainly if you've never looked, you don't know what's there. You don't know who you are without your kind of narrative or the story of who you are. So
that's true.
It's quite profound practice, and once you kind of start, you want more because it feels nice too.
I've got another question, if that's all right, just coming from Michael. Hi, Michael. I wonder how helpful mindfulness would be then as a crisis intervention with people who are highly distressed. Is it effective? That kind of sort of thing you've been talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, I think I just basically touched upon that. And it's like, I think in times of real crisis, sometimes it's not the time to be mindful, it's kind of release your emotion, be angry, in a constructive way, or kind of maybe it's time for talking. That's not to say while we are not, releasing our anger or talking, we can't be mindful. In one way, it's a little bit too simplistic to say, oh, can we do it here but not here? It depends on the approach, because of course you can be mindful in these moments too, if you kind of really kind of heightened sense of awareness and you're kind of aware how bodily sensations are changing, grief, actually, what is grief? Where's it located? It's going, it's changing, and why am I anxious? What's this thought? And you're kind of approaching your kind of introspective world differently. It can be very valuable in a crisis. I'm not saying, oh, don't use it in a crisis. I'm saying we're all kind of so unique and different. Real crisis is probably not going to work, but in times of crisis, I go to it. The only thing to stable my mind before, because it's so worked up, because it's so overexcited or so kind of fearful, bit of mindfulness, right in the middle again. And there's that kind of balance. So it's all about balance. So yes, in a crisis, but equally, potentially, no in a crisis.
What about, if you don't mind me asking, because I've just noticed the time, it's just whizzed by.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. That's how mindful we are. What a good influence you are. So, I guess I'd like to pick your brains before we head out. Is about what happens on the days when it's difficult. So it's nothing catastrophe is happening. It's just very hard to settle. You can't quite get your focus. What have you got any advice or support around that?
There should be a lot of self-compassion with mindfulness, because we can't beat ourselves up for not being mindful enough. It becomes then like a task, and then in that way we compartmentalize it and go, oh, I don't like it actually. I prefer to watch TV or to have a pint of lager or a few cigarettes or whatever, and then I'll be calm. So it's like this kind of got to really approach it with a sense of being kind to yourself, that you may be mindful of a very mindful day or do an hour of meditation that day, but the next day, something's happened, someone said something, whatever, and it's just a bit more difficult. So if you do 5 minutes, that's fantastic.
I think what you were saying about training the mindfulness muscle is really, really important, isn't it? Because when I'm somebody who I've always got a million things in my head, and I'm quite flighty in my thinking, and often poor concentration, and so mindfulness was really hard for me at first, and it still is, and I think this is assumption that you're failing at mindfulness if you can't switch off from your thoughts and you're just totally in the zone of mindfulness, and that's not the case. And I find when I'm really, really stressed and I can only do 5 minutes of mindfulness because I know I've got 101 other things I need to be doing, it's still really beneficial for me to take that 5 minutes of mindfulness. And it's probably more beneficial than it is when I'm really calm and I can do an hour of mindfulness. And I think that certainly, mindfulness is really recommended, for example, with ADHD, isn't it? I think the message needs to be out there that mindfulness isn't about being able to be, sit in a meditative state for an hour a day kind of thing. And I think, just practicing it little and often helps. And it's not about being able to be, perfectly in a mindfulness state that you forget about everything else. It can still be beneficial, even if you can only do a few minutes of it.
Exactly, yeah. It's like, I think I said before the chat, but you're only kind of as mindful as your last moment. So irrespective of 20 years experience or whatever, if I'm mindless then and say something out of turn or whatever, then, it's all gone. But it's the remembering that's the key, and that's actually mindfulness itself, is just the reminder, the remembering, the awareness of your own state of mind. So you never kind of switch off thoughts. You kind of just become more aware of them there. Yeah. And then through this awareness, you can observe them coming up and then going, you're not kind of solidified and identified with them, that you're kind of in your movie-like existence all the time. So it's just you heighten that awareness. It doesn't say you stop being you. It's like, with a balloon on a string, you can let the balloon rise and see the thought, but you're not necessarily that connected to it. So it doesn't have to have any kind of influence on you if you don't want it to. And that's kind of more mindful. And that's actually it's not that difficult to be doing or trying little and often, because it's just a reminder muscle. It's probably like, one of an obscure muscle, I think, under your arm or something. It's kind of, it's not an obvious thing, but actually when you work it, it's so important. So it's fundamental. So it's just that reminder of, okay, what's my head doing now?
Yeah. I think the other thing, before we move to the final 5 minutes for me, is about not having to keep still either to do mindfulness. So I remember when I did the 8-week course, I went home and I thought it'd be great for my children to practice mindfulness. But of course, I couldn't get them to keep still, particularly my daughter, who, is forever dancing around the room. And it was like I had to have a change of mindset about it, that particularly with young people, it's not, she can incorporate mindfulness into her movement. We don't have to, lay down and meditate. There are other ways. And I feel that particularly for young people, mindfulness, could be hugely beneficial, and we just need to adapt the way we think about it. And probably the same for people who, are really agitated and can't sit still. There are other ways that we can practice mindfulness.
Yeah, like an embodied mindfulness. You kind of bring it into life, and you notice when it's not there. And then that's when you start to progress, make kind of progression, it's like, without mindfulness, I'm actually kind of a bit more unstable here. So this kind of noticing of how beneficial it is doesn't have to necessarily be sat meditating, although it does help, to kind of ground yourself, and just work with the body then, isn't it? And the kind of, they're totally linked, the mind and the body. One thing happens in one and the other's affected. So if in times of real agitation and things, if you calm the mind, you calm the body. Yeah. And equally, if you calm the body, you calm the mind. So it's the different, your kind of approach to all of it in different contexts. Because we're not monks or nuns, like we're, Western practitioners in busy work lives. We've got husbands, cats, dogs, and we're distracted. We've got a mobile phone that we probably unconsciously check 5-10 times an hour. So we got to deal with reality. Let's not, dress it up. We're really distracted, kind of mentally all over the place all the time. So a way of embodying and making mindfulness more real to us is about dealing with what's around us. So mindfully checking the phone, mindful of how long you're on the phone. It's kind of, seeps into everything. If you want it to,
Well, I'm conscious we're coming to the end, and I wondered whether you had any final thoughts, really, particularly for people who may be listening that haven't tried mindfulness before. Any tips, advice? Where do people get started? Where do people find your book as well? We will share the link to it as well for people who are following on Twitter.
That's great. Yeah. So I've got a book here. It's like I'm pre-prepared. It's called Why Mindfulness is Not Enough: Unlocking Compassion with Equanimity. I think most of this discussion's been around mindfulness, and it's really useful. Why it's not enough in this book is because it touches upon some of the things we've touched upon in terms of the context in which it's used, the kind of ethics behind it, the motivation, and some of the contemporary issues that we're up against. And then it introduces equanimity as a construct, which I've defined is to do with your discrimination faculties, which is kind of complicated language really, for your likes and dislikes and neutralities towards phenomena and experience and people. So it's to do with those, but sort of being aware, heightened awareness of those with kind of self-compassion and compassion for others. So there's two types of equanimity. There's kind of inner equanimity that we kind of cultivate over time, and then an external one. So we're then patient with others' likes and dislikes, neutralities, so we can be more compassionate. So what I did was devised an equanimity barriers scale. What barriers are we up against in terms of well-being and equanimity? Where do our judgments come from? Why do we judge the way we do? All questions like that are kind of approached. And that's, based upon the idea that I didn't think non-judgmental was enough. Rather than not judging the judgments that are there, it's kind of perhaps more therapeutically beneficial to turn towards your judgments with a bit of wisdom. And that's equanimity, understanding the role the mind is playing in the judgmental process before we kind of have this kind of deeper acceptance towards things. And in that way, it becomes more of a pro-social thing with compassion for others. So the book kind of situates itself, a couple of chapters, why mindfulness isn't enough, and then talks about the research, and then offers case studies, down-to-earth case studies, and meditations as well. It's got some guided tips in there. So it's supposed to be a hands-on practical thing, but it's in the early stages. It only got published about 10 days ago. So I'm now trying to say, if you're interested, it's on my website, which I think there's a link down there. Trying to make equanimity the next conversation.
Yeah. Thank you. Nicky, anything before we finish from you? Any final questions?
Yeah, we've tweeted out links to NHS, to Joey's book. If anyone does have any questions that occur to them later on, please feel free to put them on the hashtag on Twitter, and we'll circle back because we do keep an eye on that. So if you do have any more, please ask. But thank you very much. And thanks, Joey, for such a kind of calm, kind of peaceful conversation. It's been lovely. Thank you.
You're more than welcome. Yeah, thanks for hosting.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's been great, and I will look up your book as well. So thank you, and we'll end on that note, shall we? Thank you for everyone who's listening, and we will have a look at the hashtag later, and any questions we'll forward those on to yourself, Joey, if that's okay. And we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Night. Bye.